Chicago Bears fans are always going to have some bias towards the players on their own team. But I'm starting to wonder if there's a fairly significant perception gap around Justin Fields when you compare how he's viewed in Chicago compared to everywhere else.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. On the show today, a discussion about Justin Fields and how he's viewed, how we look back at his rookie season and how that shapes our projections for his second season and beyond, what it could mean for his career, and how that seems to be different in Chicago compared to elsewhere. This all kind of stems from Minnesota Vikings fans, really, I think, taking this to an extreme, but it brings up greater questions about, okay, the things that we saw happen with Fields last season, how much of those things can we say are explanations versus excuses, and should we be more concerned than we are, or are we seeing something watching every Bears game that not everybody else is seeing about Justin Fields, and ultimately we will then be proven right if things pan out in that way. This all started with our friends from Locked On Minnesota. It's sort of a new thing we're doing on the podcast network here. It's sort of a citywide, not just team-specific, but citywide sports show on the Locked On Podcast Network with former NFL player Ron Johnson. And he was interviewing Spice Adams, the former Chicago Bears defensive lineman, who's a media member down here, and really funny in his Instagram videos and on Twitter and all that stuff. Plus, he's part of the Inside the Bears show with the actual team. And what started as sort of a fairly regular run-of-the-mill sports talk type discussion about Justin Fields ultimately spilled over onto Twitter, where Vikings fans came out in full force, specifically in my mentions, and I think really kind of brought this conversation forward today. So let's start with what Johnson and Spice Adams were saying and kind of see how it went from there.
I know when you're looking at quarterback play, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Russell Wilson, there's a lot of quarterbacks people would say we would take them over Justin Fields. Like we would trade Tom Brady for Justin Fields just to try to get 1 year and get a Super Bowl. If you were to look at Justin Fields and Kirk Cousins, would you take Kirk Cousins over Justin Fields?
Hey man, you know what? Kirk Cousins get a lot of heat, man, but he's really one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the league. If you look at his numbers, I think he threw for more yards than the MVP.
Yeah.
The MVP this year was Aaron Rodgers, right? I think he threw for more yards than he did. Maybe he may have had 3 or 4 more interceptions, but I'm really I'm okay with his stats for this year. But as far as it concerned with him over Justin Fields, the way the league is set up right now, they're paying off of potential. So I don't see the Bears taking on that contract right now. I don't think they can. Because I think Kirk Cousins, you got to pay Kirk at least $30 million.
Yeah.
I don't think they're gonna do that. That'll be. I don't think that's gonna happen right there. The 30, not for the 30. No. We gonna stick with this 2 or 3 or whatever it is that we paying Justin Fields right now, and we gonna try to make it work.
So it being a Minnesota show, right? Of course, Spice Adams there is nice about it, right? He's not going to come on and be like, oh man, Kirk Cousins sucks, give me Justin Fields all day or anything like that. No, but he was very, I think, diplomatic about it and made a good point about, salary cap hit doesn't make it very realistic for the Chicago Bears, even if they would want Kirk Cousins? And of course, it's kind of a hypothetical question that doesn't fit with, reality in terms of like either team wouldn't really be looking to make that trade in that exact way. Although you could argue, I think the Vikings might be more willing to trade for Justin Fields than the Bears willing to trade for Kirk Cousins, but that's a little bit beside the point, right? I took this and that video to Twitter and said, I think Spice was being nice about it because it's a Minnesota show, but I think even the Vikings fans would rather have Justin Fields. And that's when Vikings fans came out in full force, in some part thanks to our friend Luke Braun from Locked On Vikings for retweeting it and engaging with it and putting it out there for Vikings fans to get to it. And it really opened up a lot of, so it was a surprise to me how much negativity and hate there was towards Justin Fields. Not just because, I get it, right? They're Vikings fans. They're fan of a rival team. So they're going to not be super supportive of your team's player, and they are going to be supportive of their own player. I wasn't surprised that Vikings fans said, give me Kirk Cousins over Justin Fields. What I was surprised at was specifically how they tore down Justin Fields and seemed to perceive the perception of Justin Fields from these Vikings fans. And we've seen this, I think, from other, outside of Chicago, media members, analysts, and certainly fans of other teams have similar talking points about, looking over Fields' rookie season and feeling like it was not good, and that all of a sudden now, the Bears, should they start thinking about other potential quarterback options? I mean, like, all this stuff starts to come out so quickly after Fields played, 10 starts, I think 12 total appearances in games last season. And all of it jumped out at me as like, are we in too much of a Justin Fields bubble in Chicago right now? Are we too quick to gloss over some of the stuff, or is everyone else missing the boat? So I guess we'll go through some of the striking criticism and examples of like just how far reaching and how almost extreme Justin Fields takes are, and then kind of look at, okay, where's the truth here? Where's the nuance? Where's the actual, reality of the situation? Next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net, your number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. No matter what sport it is, they've got you covered. Even football, it's the offseason, but you can still bet on the NFL draft, prop bets on where certain prospects will go, how many players at a certain position will go in the first round, how many trades will there be, and so much more, plus all the other sports. You can get your baseball bets in now with that season right around the corner. NBA playoffs are just about here, and that'll be lots of fun with a little bit of money down on those games. You can find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championships, odds, reviews, news for all the different leagues this season at betonline.net. It is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores, plus your favorite Vegas casino games online as well. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The reaction to Justin Fields versus Kirk Cousins discussion, right? Which I'm not super interested in that, the nuances of like, okay, Fields versus Cousins. I'm more interested in the perception here. And Vikings fans came out in full force. And I would always expect, right, that fan base of rival team, to some extent, you're going to get trolls, right? You're going to get people that come on there and are just there to troll. And honestly, if we're going to be honest with you, when I go on Twitter and I say I think even Vikings fans would rather have Fields over Kirk Cousins, I am also, in fact, tongue-in-cheek, slightly trolling. I think it's not being completely disingenuous. I do think some Vikings fans should and would prefer Justin Fields over Kirk Cousins, and I do think I can make a decent argument for taking Justin Fields over Kirk Cousins, and that I would take Justin Fields over Kirk Cousins. But when I specifically say I think Vikings fans would do this, I am a little bit intentionally poking the bear a little bit there. I will certainly admit that. And so, of course, I can expect some troll level response that doesn't really have any sort of basis in reality, like when someone tweeted me and asked, "Are you smoking crack?" Right? I mean, of course, like there's not really a substance to that discussion. But then the quote was, "You smoking crack, dude." I need to be accurate in the response I got from @AdamSCHW. But it got a little bit more specific than that in some of these ways that I was really surprised to. Like @Daniel Penrod 11 said, "No, Minnesota wouldn't. Nobody wants Fields right now!" ! Or you've got LOL, speak for yourselves. We don't want that trash for a quarterback. Give me Kirk 10 times out of 10. We got from @JD Gossi. What? Why would Vikings fans want a bust? I'm like, wait a minute. Do Vikings fans actually think like Justin Fields is a draft bust? Like, I tweet from Purple Skull 18, which you imagine is a very unbiased and non-homer Vikings fan. I think you're a dope because that's not how Vikings fans typo, fell at all. Fields is trash. Or we got a not at all. Fields is a bust. And then one certainly took it to another level when he said Trevor Siemian greater than Justin Fields. And someone else said Justin Fields equals Christian Ponder. We also had I'd rather have Davis Mills from the Houston Texans than Justin Fields. He's shown no promise whatsoever. Also, I'd rather have Kellen Mond than Justin Fields, and Mond is QB3 on the Vikings. And yes, I'm willing to pass off a lot of it as just like trolling and people not actually being, genuine about how they feel about Fields and really just sort of defending their team and their guy. But as I kind of pointed out, like, that's not them saying, "Oh, Kirk Cousins is really good and I would rather have him over Justin Fields." It's saying, no, Justin Fields is actually bad, and that Kirk Cousins, regardless of whether Kirk Cousins is any good or not, Justin Fields is therefore much, much worse. And I'm just surprised to see it go to that extreme and to go that direction. Because I could understand somebody saying, yes, like, hey, Kirk Cousins is thrown for 4,000 yards the last couple seasons. He was a Pro Bowler this year. 33-7 touchdown to interception ratio, completed over 66% of his passes or whatever. Like, yeah, okay, we can start to have that conversation. But when we get to Kellen Mond and Davis Mills versus Justin Fields, all of a sudden that starts to be sort of another level there. And I should say, it wasn't exclusively Vikings fans that all hated Justin Fields, right? Grant_Schweiger said, definitely wanted Fields last year in the draft and still think he can be a good quarterback. Not sure what the Bears are putting around him is going to help him succeed much, though. And that's what I kept coming back to, was like, do you remember in the draft last season, the Vikings were one of the teams that the Chicago Bears traded up to trade past to get Justin Fields? And I don't know if it was specifically reported or if it was just a perception among Vikings fans, but like the feeling was that the Vikings wanted Fields with their pick and that the Bears jumped them and scooped them for him. And like Vikings fans last year were disappointed that they didn't land Justin Fields, and they were kind of upset that it was the Chicago Bears that drafted Justin Fields. And all of a sudden, 12 months later, because of a dozen or a little less games under Matt Nagy, with albeit some very real issues in there and not stellar performances all around from Justin Fields, all of a sudden he's a bust. He's worse than Kellen Mond, who Mike Zimmer didn't even want to make active last season because they didn't think it's right. I'm not trying to like lend too much actual credibility to some of the more like disingenuous arguments. Like another one said, Fields and Cousins are likely both off of their team's roster after 4 seasons. Right? I mean, just some of that stuff just doesn't seem to have a ton of reality there. But it makes me wonder, like, how much of a perception gap is there? Like, does everyone look at that Fields? Because you look at Fields' stat line, right? And if you weren't a Chicago Bears fan and you saw, 59% completion percentage, 7 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, and you might think not a great quarterback, right? Passer rating 73.2, that's bad compared to other statistical performances of quarterbacks in the NFL. But I think we can all sit here having watched every game last season and say, well, it's a little bit more complicated, and it goes beyond just what the box score numbers say. And that also kind of sounds like an excuse, but it also kind of sounds like a valid explanation for everything that we saw going on with this team last season. So we'll kind of parse this out a little bit and find a little bit more of the truth somewhere in the middle here about Justin Fields. What is an explanation? What's an excuse? What the perception should be, or should we be more concerned, or are we in Chicago watching him? Do we actually know better than the people on the outside who maybe saw a little bit less, but maybe don't have the same insulated bias that we do have being around and seeing and hearing about Justin Fields every single day? We'll kind of go through all that and kind of find a landing point where we can all feel a little bit more gray somewhere in the middle between the black and white we're so often stuck in. Next on Locked On Bears. Like I said at the top, I'm not interested really in doing the would you rather have Kirk Cousins or Justin Fields debate? Because there's too many tangential of okay, well, are you just talking about winning one game right now? Or are you talking about just for winning this season? Or are you talking about put him on the team now and then you kind of deal with it from there? And then you have the contract situation and the team building. And it's it's a bunch of hypotheticals that we're getting off in that we end up arguing about nonsense, which in the first place, it's kind of nonsense. But I think it's more interesting to get into this idea of okay, are we looking at him with blue and orange colored goggles here? And not that Vikings fans and their he's a bust talk would be the actual accurate truth, but maybe are we? It just makes me wonder if are we glossing over too much, right? Are we too blinded by potential and wanting to be right and all those different things from drafting him and feeling like he should be the future of the franchise? Is that affecting our ability to accurately judge how well Justin Fields is performing and how much potential he still has? And I certainly am not going to, I certainly don't think, all of a sudden on second thought, Justin Fields is terrible and the Bears are screwed and they need a new quarterback. No, that's not the conclusion of this thought exercise here. But I do think it's important to kind of work through what is and isn't valid criticism of Justin Fields, and then of the criticism, what is and isn't, I guess valid for his long-term prognostication here, right? Yes, he was more inaccurate last season than he should have been. He threw more interceptions last season than you would have liked him to see. He fumbled the ball more than you would like to see. He took too many sacks. He held onto the ball a little bit too long. I mean, those are all true statements. I think the question is, how concerned should you actually be about those things? And of course, paired with many of the positives that we did see in terms of playmaking ability and the arm strength, the arm talent, the difficult throws he made downfield, the way he was able to extend plays with his legs, the leadership, the command of the offense he was able to slowly sort of build up to as the team, finally put him in that position, because that's sort of the third factor here, right? It's not just the positives we saw from Fields and the negatives we saw from Fields, but also the things out of Justin Fields' control that impacted his ability to perform. When we talk about struggles on the offensive line, game plan and scheme issues from the very start, him not getting a chance to work with the wide receivers and the first team in the offensive line, and the team really not preparing him for that starting role. Those would all be things that would lend yourself to think that maybe the product we saw on the field was, I don't want to say artificially worse, but influenced to be worse than purely a pure reflection of Justin Fields' ability and his development. That it wasn't like he was put in this position and didn't do very well with an otherwise clean slate, right? It's not to excuse all of the mistakes he made as not his fault, and you can't blame everything on game plan, personnel, Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace type stuff. But it is a factor in this discussion. It is part of the explanation. And I'm weary. I'm like, well, is that an excuse? Of course, everyone points to Justin Herbert having such a good rookie season. Otherwise, a lot of rookie quarterbacks have generally struggled. And I think that's part of the problem here, is that we're a little bit recency biased towards wanting to see the Justin Herberts and not realizing that a lot of rookie quarterbacks don't tend to have overly productive rookie seasons. Whereas I think Fields ended up a little bit closer to average than maybe Vikings fans on Twitter would lead us to believe. But I think some Bears fans feel like Fields is this sure thing also that's guaranteed or looks like he's really going to be that franchise-changing quarterback. And I would argue that all the potential is there, but let's actually see it happen first, because plenty of quarterbacks will have that potential. And I think he has shown the capabilities to do so. It's just not easier said than done. And it's, jury is still out on exactly how good Justin Fields is going to be. But when you see those flashes and him doing the things that would seem to be the most difficult for young quarterbacks, that tends to bode well when it seems like a lot of his mistakes and some of those things are a little bit more easily correctable and can be improved if many of the external factors from last season are improved. That can improve his ability to be a little bit more accurate, to maybe not hold on to the ball as long, and to be a little bit more steady at some of those times, and just like come in without having to learn on the fly and adjust to a bad game plan. That if they can put him in a better position to be successful, then this season we can get a much more accurate portrayal of what Justin Fields will be able to do. There's sort of an if there, or maybe a win, but it still does require them to put that better team around him. And right now there's some questions in terms of like wide receiver depth is still a little bit lacking. Offensive line still needs probably another starter, and the defense still needs some work too. And that's why maybe there's some trepidation a little bit for now. We see people like Mina Kimes from ESPN kind of express how she's disappointed that the Bears haven't done more to build around Justin Fields yet this offseason. There's still time to build more around Justin Fields this offseason, but it's part of this equation, because if we go through another season next year where we feel like the receivers aren't good enough and the offensive line's not good enough, and it's 2 years now of kind of saying, well, he still hasn't really been put in that position to be successful, at what point do you start asking, would a great quarterback truly be able to overcome those things, right? I'm not trying to get into these sort of like future hypothetical criticisms of Justin Fields before he deserves them, but just more so pointing out that it is still open for interpretation. It is not the bust level of some of the outside voices, but maybe it's not as rosy and steady and surefire as a lot of people in Chicago might want to believe. And that's not a criticism of Justin Fields. It's just a statement of how it goes when you draft a young player and they've played for 10 games and they showed you some ups and they showed you some downs. And I think I'm more encouraged by the ups than I am discouraged by the downs, but nothing's guaranteed in the NFL. And so much of it does have to do with the other 10 players around them and the coaching staff around them. And that, unless you're truly going to be, the Tom Brady's of the world or whatever, which isn't a fair expectation for Fields or anybody, then there's more to it than just what we saw on the field last season. There's plenty of reason to expect this to get better in 2022 and certainly beyond 2022. And maybe plenty of reason to think that Vikings fans will look back and say, it's too bad we didn't land Justin Fields, because instead we're stuck with Kirk Cousins' $35 million contract and a 7-9, or I guess now what, 7-8? No, wait. It'd be 8-9 or 9-8 seasons if Kirk Cousins keeps hovering right around those 500 numbers. That's what Vikings fans have had to look forward to every year with Kirk Cousins. Let's see, it was 8-7, 10-5, 7-9, 8-8, because Cousins, I believe, missed one game last year, didn't play in one game last season. So if they're going to enjoy their 500 quarterback, and Bears fans actually have like some long-term hope and optimism to look for at quarterback, and I will take that 10 times out of 10 over the Vikings kind of feeling a little bit stuck in quarterback purgatory. Well, by the way, having two really good wide receivers and a really good running back for that quarterback and still being a 500 football team pretty consistently, I think that says a lot about Kirk Cousins too. Plus, Cousins is a quarterback that requires structure, and when the play breaks down, you're not getting much out of Kirk Cousins. And Justin Fields excels when the plays break down, and he's got more of those special traits, whereas Cousins is more of the run-of-the-mill kind of quarterback. Got to get my Vikings jabs in there here right at the end. But hey, that's what we do here on the Locked On Bears podcast. We just kind of check base on some of the bigger, deeper questions about this Bears team and not just the Cousins versus Fields debate. Anyway, I appreciate you tuning in and making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We'll be back tomorrow with even more in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Looking ahead to the NFL draft, we'll start to get to know some of these draft prospects a little bit more, specifically those guys in the second round with those 2 second-round picks. The wide receivers, the offensive linemen, the defensive backs, those are coming. We'll get you all set. Plus, any and all free agent moves the Bears still make between now and draft day, and of course, after the NFL draft, we'll be on top of that as well. So I hope you'll keep tuning in, and I hope as a result that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it just a little bit easier for you to bear down.